Before I went to seminary, I taught middle school in Baltimore City, Maryland. Specifically, I taught English to speakers of other languages, or ESOL, in a couple of middle schools. And most of my ESOL students, almost all of them in those schools, were recently resettled refugees from Nepal, Bhutan, the Horn of Africa, and the Middle East. Sometimes it was hilarious and sublime and life-giving. I will never forget the day one of my 8th graders came in before the first bell and demanded that I teach him the English word for what was happening on his face. It was his first big zit. But other times, the complexity and the trauma, both of my kids in my classroom and the kids in the other classrooms in the school, were overwhelming. And I felt inadequate pretty much every day that I walked into work. One day I was showing a documentary to my intermediate students who'd been in the country for a few years but still needed a decent amount of support with their English learning. And it was the PBS documentary Eyes on the Prize about the Civil Rights era. We had just finished a segment about the Freedom Riders and paused the video for discussion. One student raised her hand and asked, "Miss Roberts, what were those white people doing?" Sirens blared in my head. This is not a drill. This was the moment all of the anti-racism workshops I had ever been to was leading to. This was my entire Unitarian Universalist childhood, youth, and young adulthood, and we're all leading to this moment where I would explain the inner workings of racism in our country. I launched into my explanation of how it was possible to engage in violent hate. Briefly, before my student interrupted me with the sort of patient disdain that only 7th graders can muster. No, Miss Roberts. What were those white people on the bus doing? The ones with the black people. I helpfully began, before stumbling haphazardly through trying to explain the inner workings of why white people sometimes acted in solidarity with black people. Meanwhile, my brain was mostly blue screening. Let's just say I'm glad there's no recording of what I said in that moment. Right, what confounded my student wasn't the racism, the violence. She had context for all of that. What confounded her was that there were white people who would risk their lives for their black neighbors. Nothing in her lived experience, none of the nice white people she had met in the refugee resettlement process, none of the nice white teachers she had had, not even me and my impeccably anti-racist politics, had given her any context for that kind of solidarity from white people. And that moment for me was an inflection point in my learning, because it put right in my face that trying to have the right political positions, that trying to avoid saying offensive things, those were me trying to avoid something, trying to make sure I didn't break any of those external rules about racism, and I had gotten pretty skilled at making sure that nobody could mistake me for a white supremacist. But what did I actually want to do? Who did I actually want to be in relationship to people? That was harder to articulate. And suddenly, all that had felt certain and rigid in my understanding of what it meant to dismantle racism as a white person was shifting. It was amorphous and no longer dependable. Writer and teacher Adrienne Maree Brown has offered people seeking to make sense of this world and dismantling the systems that oppress people in it and keep us separate from one another. Right? Adrienne Maree Brown's work gives us frameworks to understand the possibility of our own wholeness and how to deepen and shift our practices in pursuit of that wholeness. There's a million of them. The most popular one is probably emergent strategy, but her more recent book, Loving Corrections, explores different dimensions of accountability. How is it that we evaluate and adjust the ways we are doing things when things are not going right? In her section on accountability, specifically, she offers this reflection. I think this kind of external living creates in us a collective fragility. If we are constantly tracking each other for things that need accountability, always operating in the pursuit of the approval of others, or being held to standards set by others, how can we trust our own choices? If accountability happens outside of us and is judged and corrected by others, how can we learn to recognize, let alone honor, our own needs and values? We're going to repeat a sentence because it's not just 7th graders who need a little extra to help us learn. So here we go. If accountability happens outside of us and is judged and corrected by others, how can we learn to recognize, let alone honor, our own needs and values? And she continues, we are fragile because we are not living with internal clarity around what feels right to us. So we lack the internal capacity to assess the potential harm of each action. Too many of us are living according to an amorphous, highly adaptive, and reductive external standard of accountability. Instead of rooting our choices in what we truly believe and value, we end up making choices that conform to a variety of external values and standards. Again, we're going to do one more sentence repeat. Adults pretend we don't need extra help, but we do. We are fragile because we are not living with internal clarity around what feels right to us. So we lack the internal capacity to assess the potential harm of each action. So I experience that framework as a reframe from a desire not to offend, which, to be clear, this is not an invitation for you to suddenly become offensive because you think it's funny. No, don't do that. Right? But I experience this framework as a reframe away from, right, a primary orientation that my goal is to not offend people towards a desire to act in alignment with my values. It's a reframe from how can I avoid getting called out by the people who share my values, which you don't have to put up your hands, but think in your heart, how many of us have taken an action because we want to avoid a call out from the people who share our values? Right? It's a reframe away from that and towards what am I called to do because of my values? And why that matters in this moment is that this better world, this mutual respect, this community that we're building, we have to want it when nobody is watching. If we only want the way we are together to be just and affirming and good when we feel like someone else is watching, that's not very Unitarian Universalist of us, Because as Unitarian Universalists, we have to want it when nobody is watching because our theology is not a threat. It's a promise. Right? It's not a threat. We're not trying to be good on this earth because there might be a lake of fire waiting for us afterwards. That's not how we do it here, right? Our whole universalist deal is that we experience a love bigger than any of us and in turn center that love in our lives. And that love at the center stuff, that side with love stuff, it's more than political positions. It's more than trying to avoid saying offensive things, more than trying to conform to some external standard of liberalism or even an external standard of progressivism. Well, maybe it's not more than all of those things. Maybe it's smaller than all of those things. Smaller. It's less certain, more intimate, less constrained, more relational. Less shame, more complexity. Less fear, and more clarity. My goodness, don't we need that in this moment? As we watch children starve in real time, emboldened by our own government, we somehow struggle to find the language and the courage and the depth of relationship to speak to our values about it with one another. As leaders from all directions, seem eager to treat our trans siblings and children as a bargaining chip rather than whole humans, but we are still having anxiety meltdowns about pronouns. As people in our neighborhoods and our families and people here in the pews this morning, if you think they're not here, I assure you they are, who are facing unthinkable choices as they prepare to lose their Badger Care, or Medicaid benefits. But we can't quite full-throatedly declare people over profit because it might be uncomfortable, because some people in here have profited, and won't that make them uncomfortable? Won't that not be nice to them? And our little conflict-averse Midwestern hearts start to seize. And friends, me too. Just because I had that revelation when I was teaching doesn't mean I have it all figured out, doesn't mean I have figured out the fullness of what it means to hold myself accountable to living my values with integrity in this work. Maybe I've just learned more about what doesn't work. So here's something. Nugget. I had that revelation when I was teaching doesn't mean I have it all something that hasn't mean I have figured out the fullness of what it means to hold myself accountable. So maybe it'll help you too. There are, as you are well aware, 1,001 different trainings. Maybe I've just learned more about what ideas, inventories, cross-cultural. So here's something quizzes that you can take to try to understand what's wrong with you and what you need to fix about yourself. And then eventually, if you do enough of those trainings, the anti-racism thermometer goes to the top, and then we've solved racism, right? Is that not how it works? Oh boy. All right, well, my favorite of those frameworks is called the Cultural Humility Framework. It was developed in the 90s in a healthcare setting by the professors Melanie Torvalone and Jan Murray Garcia. And it was originally a way for providers to interact with people in ways that were less racist and more culturally sensitive, and the framework they had was called Cultural Humility. It is still one of them, it's like one of those, it's like a Honda Accord. It's just like, it's still going after the 90s. Beautiful. And the thing that I love about this framework for Unitarian Universalists is that the beginning of this framework is ongoing critical self-reflection. And now, later in the framework, or also as part of the framework, there is an invitation to institutional accountability. But it's like sticking a Post-it note over that part for you today. Because Unitarian Universalists, in my experience, we actually love to jump to institutional accountability. Because it lets us off the hook for all the small ways that we are part of the problem. How could I be committing microaggressions? I am the chair of the Social Justice Committee. could I commit a microaggression? I'm the minister. Me? Yes, you. Me. And so I invite us to begin with ongoing critical self-reflection, because that is how we develop that critical insight that Adrienne Maree Brown is talking about, that ability to assess the potential harm of an action or inaction right inside of us, before it comes out of our mouth, rather than letting it come out and waiting for someone to email us and tell us that we maybe did a racism in that meeting. Or letting it come out of our mouth and then following it up with, I'm so bad with pronouns. Right? We have to reflect on our own practice. And in doing that, it's simpler than any of the infinity of trainings because it starts small. It starts with knowing that accountability has to come from within you and within us. And when things are murky in human relationship, because I have some news for you about groups of oppressed people and how they think about different things. Are you ready for a secret? Not all people of color agree with each other. Not all trans people agree with each other. Not all women agree with each other. Definitely not all queer people agree with each other. So when things are murky, that is a moment to turn towards our values, towards love, away from shame and fear. And instead of waiting for someone else in the room to call us out, let's let our values call us out of our fragility and into those clear and small and intimate places of change that, taken together, might change our world. May it be so. Amen.